He kicked a quiet black woman in court, not knowing she was his soon-to-be chief. Now the badge he hid behind is crumbling, and justice is coming from the inside out. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The polished courtroom floor reflected the harsh fluorescent lights. Each scuff marked a testament to countless unheard pleas and rushed judgments. Officer Frank Miller, his uniform starched to an uncomfortable stiffness, surveyed the morning's docket with a familiar boredom. Municipal court was a revolving door of petty offenses, and he, a 10-year veteran with a chip on his shoulder the size of his badge, considered himself above it all. His eyes, cold and dismissive, landed on a black woman seated quietly in the public gallery. She was in her late 40s, dressed in a simple but professional navy pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. There was an air of quiet composure about her, a stillness that somehow irritated Miller. He didn't recognize her as one of the usual court regulars, the lawyers, the chronic defendants, the worried family members. She was just there, an unknown, and therefore, in Miller's book, a potential problem. As Judge Harrison finally took the bench, and the first few minor traffic violations were dispensed with, a small commotion occurred near the back. A young man, clearly agitated, was arguing with another bailiff about a confiscated cell phone. Miller, always eager to assert his dominance, strode towards the disturbance. The woman in the navy suit, who had been observing the proceedings intently, shifted slightly in her seat to get a better view. As Miller roughly manhandled the young man towards the exit, he passed directly in front of her. Whether by accident or by some subconscious, aggressive impulse, Miller's heavy boot caught the woman's ankle, not hard enough to cause serious injury, but certainly enough to be a deliberate, contemptuous kick. "Watch where you're sitting, lady," Miller sneered over his shoulder without breaking stride, a smirk playing on his lips. The woman looked down at her ankle, then back at Miller's retreating form, her expression unreadable but for a flicker of something cold and resolute in her eyes. She didn't cry out, didn't protest. She simply absorbed the insult, the casual brutality of it, filing it away. A few onlookers gasped, others quickly looked away, unwilling to get involved. The courtroom machinery ground on, oblivious or indifferent to the small act of malice that had just occurred. The woman, Serena Washington, remained seated, her composure immaculate, though a faint flush had risen on her cheekbones. What Officer Miller, in his arrogant ignorance, couldn't possibly know was that Serena Washington was not just another anonymous face in the crowd. She was the city's newly appointed, but not yet publicly announced, chief of police, brought in from a larger, more progressive department on the East Coast with a mandate for sweeping reform in this notoriously troubled precinct. And she had just personally experienced the very culture of contempt and abuse she was here to dismantle. Before we dive deeper into this electrifying story of justice and reckoning, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe that power, especially in law enforcement, must always be wielded with accountability and respect, hit that like button and subscribe, because the next episode will show you exactly what happens when a system of abuse meets an immovable object of integrity. The fallout from this seemingly minor courtroom incident is about to send shockwaves through an entire police department. Serena Washington had arrived in Northwood City 3 days prior, not with fanfare or a press conference, but quietly, almost invisibly. The city council, after a tumultuous year marked by scandals of police misconduct and plummeting public trust, had made the bold decision to recruit an outsider, a reformer with a proven track record. Serena, with her distinguished career, her doctorate in criminology, and her reputation for successfully implementing community policing initiatives in departments twice the size of Northwood's, had been their unanimous choice. Her official start date was still a week away, but she had insisted on this period of incognito observation. She wanted to see the Northwood Police Department, the NWPD, in its natural state, unfiltered by the presence of a new, scrutinizing chief. She wanted to understand the ground truth, to witness firsthand the challenges she would face. The municipal court, often the first point of contact between citizens and the justice system, seemed like a logical place to start. She had dressed deliberately in unassuming civilian clothes, blending into the background, a silent observer of the daily dramas. The incident with Officer Miller was, in a perverse way, invaluable. It was a raw, unvarnished data point, a clear indicator of the ingrained disrespect and casual aggression that she had been warned about. As she sat there, the dull ache in her ankle a physical reminder of Miller's contempt, Serena's resolve hardened. This wasn't just a job. It was a mission. Northwood was a city deeply divided. Years of aggressive policing tactics, particularly in its minority neighborhoods, had created a chasm of mistrust. The old guard within the NWPD, a clique of veteran officers who saw themselves as a beleaguered brotherhood holding the line against societal decay, resisted any suggestion of change. Officer Frank Miller was a prime example of this old guard mentality. He was known for his high arrest numbers, his tough-on-crime rhetoric, and a string of citizen complaints that had somehow always been dismissed or lost in the internal affairs shuffle. He and his ilk viewed any attempt at reform as an attack on their authority, a capitulation to political correctness. Serena knew that dismantling this entrenched culture would be her greatest challenge. It wouldn't be enough to change policies. She would have to change hearts and minds, or, failing that, remove those who were irrevocably resistant to the principles of fair and impartial policing. After the courtroom session adjourned, Serena lingered, watching Miller interact with his fellow officers. She saw the easy camaraderie, the shared jokes, the subtle deference shown to him by younger, more impressionable recruits. He was clearly a man of influence within his sphere, a purveyor of the department's toxic undercurrent. Later that day, Serena met discreetly with Captain Maria Rodriguez, one of the few high-ranking female officers in the NWPD and someone who had been quietly advocating for reform from within. They met in a small, out-of-the-way coffee shop, far from the prying eyes of the precinct. The Miller incident is, unfortunately, not surprising, Captain Rodriguez said, her voice low and weary after Serena recounted the courtroom assault. Frank Miller and his crew. They call themselves the Watchmen. They believe they are the law. They see any challenge to their way of doing things, especially for minorities or women, as a personal affront. They got connections, too. Internal affairs often seems to look the other way when it comes to them. Serena listened intently, absorbing every detail. Tell me more about the Watchmen, she prompted. Rodriguez sighed. They're a clique, maybe a dozen or so officers, mostly veterans, who are deeply resistant to any kind of oversight. They protect their own, cover for each other's misconduct. They're a major reason why community relations are so bad. They believe in street justice and see reform efforts as weakness. And they have a particularly ugly streak when it comes to race and gender. Are they organized? Serena asked. Informally, yes. They have their regular haunts, their unspoken codes. They can make life very difficult for any officer who doesn't toe their line or who tries to report misconduct. Several good young officers have been driven out, or worse, set up for failure after crossing them. Serena nodded slowly. This was the landscape she was stepping into. Not just a department in need of modernization, but one with an active, entrenched insurgency against the very principles she was hired to instill. The kick in the courtroom was more than just a random act of thuggery. It was a symptom of a deep-seated disease. As she left the coffee shop, Serena's mind was already formulating a strategy. She knew her official announcement as chief would send shockwaves through the old guard. They would see her as a threat, an outsider sent to dismantle their comfortable, corrupt world. She needed allies, like Captain Rodriguez. She needed irrefutable evidence, and she needed to be prepared for a fight. Her ankles still throbbed, a dull, persistent ache. But it was nothing compared to the ache she felt for a city so ill-served by those sworn to protect it. The path ahead would be arduous, fraught with resistance and perhaps even danger. But Serena Washington had never backed down from a righteous fight in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. The Watchmen had no idea who they had just kicked. The next few days were a whirlwind of covert activity for Serena. Using her network of contact from her previous posts and her academic research, she began to build a more comprehensive picture of the NWPD's internal dynamics. She met with community leaders, local activists, and even a few defense attorneys who had long battled the department's excesses in court. Each conversation painted a grimmer picture of the Watchman's influence. Stories emerged of falsified reports, planted evidence, targeted harassment of minority youth, and a deeply ingrained us versus them mentality. Officer Frank Miller's name surfaced repeatedly, often linked to excessive force complaints that had mysteriously vanished. Serena also learned that Miller was a mentor figure to several younger officers, indoctrinating them into the Watchman's cynical worldview. This grooming of new recruits was particularly insidious, ensuring the perpetuation of the corrupt culture. Captain Rodriguez proved to be an invaluable, if cautious, ally. She provided Serena with sanitized internal reports, complaint statistics, use of force data, officer demographics, highlighting the stark disparities in how different communities were policed. She also identified a few other officers who might be sympathetic to reform but were too intimidated to speak out openly. There's a young officer, Ben Carter, Rodriguez mentioned during one of their discreet meetings. He's smart, idealistic, but he's been getting a lot of pressure from Miller's crew after he questioned a particularly rough arrest Miller made last month. They've started giving him the cold shoulder, assigning him bad shifts. He might be ready to talk, but he's scared. Serena made a mental note. Officer Carter could be a crucial inside source if his trust could be earned. Meanwhile, within the NWPD, rumors of a new chief were swirling, but the details were vague. The city manager, a politician named Henderson who was more concerned with optics than actual reform, had kept Serena's identity a closely guarded secret, hoping to avoid preemptive resistance from the powerful police union, which was heavily influenced by the Watchmen. Frank Miller and his cronies, however, were not idle. Sensing a potential threat to their dominance, they began to subtly flex their muscles. There was a noticeable uptick in stop and frisk incidents in minority neighborhoods, a clear message that they were still in control. They also started spreading rumors about the incoming chief, painting a picture of an out-of-touch academic, an ivory tower liberal, who would prioritize criminals over cops. Heard the new chief is some professor type, Miller scoffed to his partners during shift briefing. Probably never seen a real street in their life. Gonna come in here telling us how to do our jobs. We'll see how long that lasts. The casual sexism and arrogance were telling. They clearly didn't anticipate the new chief would be a woman, let alone a black woman with Serena's formidable credentials. Serena, through Captain Rodriguez, was aware of these machinations. It only strengthened her resolve. She knew that her first few weeks as chief would be critical. She needed to make a strong statement, to signal that the old ways were over, but she also needed to do it strategically without alienating the rank-and-file officers who were not part of the Watchman's corrupt core. Her plan began to take shape. She wouldn't just rely on policy changes and internal affairs investigations. She needed to change the narrative both within the department and in the community. She needed to build bridges with the disenfranchised and isolate the obstructionists. The memory of Miller's kick, the casual disdain in his eyes, remained a potent motivator. It wasn't just about her ankle. It was about every citizen who had ever been treated with such contempt by those sworn to serve and protect. It was about restoring honor to a tarnished badge. As her official star date approached, Serena felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. The same feeling she'd had before leading a high-stakes tactical operation or presenting a groundbreaking research paper. The risks were high, the opposition formidable, but the potential for positive change was immense. Northwood City was a tinderbox of resentment and mistrust. Serena Washington was about to strike a match. The question was whether it would illuminate a path forward or engulf the city in flames. What do you think is the most effective way to reform a corrupt police department? Is it through internal accountability, external oversight, or community engagement? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for the unfolding drama. The week before Serena Washington's official swearing-in as Northwood Chief of Police was a masterclass in strategic patience and covert preparation. While the Watchmen continued their campaign of subtle intimidation and rumor-mongering, Serena was quietly laying the groundwork for her arrival. She reached out, through Captain Rodriguez, to Officer Ben Carter, the young idealist who had reportedly questioned Miller's tactics. Their first meeting was tense. Carter was visibly nervous, aware of the risks involved in speaking to an incoming chief about departmental corruption, especially one whose identity was still largely unknown within the ranks. Serena met him not as a superior officer, but as a concerned colleague. She didn't press him for information initially, instead sharing some of her own experiences with challenging entrenched systems in other departments. She spoke of the importance of integrity, of the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, even when it's unpopular. Slowly, Carter began to open up. He recounted the rough arrest he had witnessed, Miller's blatant use of excessive force on a young black teenager who had been accused of nothing more than loitering. He described the subsequent pressure he'd faced from Miller and other members of the Watchmen, the taunts, the isolation, the veiled threats to his career. "They make you feel like you're the one who's wrong," Carter said, his voice laced with frustration. "Like caring about due process or a kid's civil rights makes you soft, makes you a traitor to the badge." Serena listened without interruption, her expression empathetic. "It takes courage to maintain your principles in an environment like that, Officer Carter," she said when he finished. "And it's officers like you who are the future of this department, not those who hide behind a distorted sense of loyalty to protect misconduct." By the end of their meeting, Carter had agreed to provide Serena with whatever information he could gather about the Watchmen's activities, names, patterns of behavior, specific incidents of abuse. He was still scared, but Serena's quiet strength and clear commitment to reform had given him a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone. Serena also began forging alliances outside the department. She held a series of confidential meetings with community activists, faith leaders, and heads of local nonprofits who had long been critical of the NWPD. Many were initially skeptical, having seen past promises of reform come to nothing. But Serena's directness, her willingness to listen to their grievances without defensiveness, and her clear articulation of her vision for a more accountable, community-oriented police force began to win them over. "We don't need more task forces or empty apologies, Chief-to-be," said Reverend Alastair Green, a respected elder in the black community. "We need action. We need accountability. We need to see officers who abuse their power face real consequences." "Understand, Reverend," Serena replied, "and I assure you, accountability will be a cornerstone of my administration. But I will also need your help. I need the community to work with us, to rebuild trust. That can only happen if there's a genuine partnership." These meetings were crucial. Serena knew that lasting reform couldn't be imposed from the top down alone. It required buy-in from the community and from within the ranks. She was building a coalition for change, preparing for the inevitable resistance she would face once her tenure began. Meanwhile, the city manager, Arthur Henderson, was growing increasingly nervous. The Watchmen, through their union contacts, had been applying pressure, demanding to know who the new chief was and what their agenda might be. Henderson, a man more adept at political maneuvering than principled leadership, was feeling the heat. He called Serena, his voice tight with anxiety. "Chief Washington, there's considerable unease within the department about your appointment. Perhaps a more gradual approach to reform might be advisable initially. We don't want to provoke a full-blown rebellion from the rank and file." Serena's response was polite but firm. "Mr. Henderson, I was hired to reform this department, not to placate those who benefit from its current dysfunction. A gradual approach to addressing systemic corruption is like a gradual approach to stopping a hemorrhage. It doesn't work. I intend to be fair, but I also intend to be decisive." Henderson was clearly not reassured, but Serena had made her position clear. She would not be intimidated or swayed from her mission. The day before her swearing-in, Serena reviewed her notes, her strategies, the chessboard of Northwood politics and policing laid out before her. She thought of Officer Miller, of his sneering face, his contemptuous kick. He was a symbol of the rot she was here to excise. He, and those like him, were about to discover that the woman they had so casually dismissed was not just their new chief. She was their reckoning. The stage was set. The players were in position. Northwood City was on the brink of a transformation, whether it was ready for it or not. The day of Serena Washington's official swearing-in ceremony arrived with a palpable tension hanging over Northwood City. The City Hall auditorium was packed. City council members, department heads, community leaders, and a large contingent of NWPD officers, many of them in dress uniform, filled the seats. The media was there in force, alerted by City Manager Henderson's carefully worded press release announcing the appointment of a highly credentialed, transformative leader. Henderson, in his opening remarks, lauded Serena's distinguished career, conveniently omitting any mention of the internal resistance or the depth of the problems she was inheriting. He painted a rosy picture of a department ready to embrace a new era of policing, a narrative that Serena knew was far from the truth. As Serena stood to take her oath, she scanned the faces in the audience. She saw Captain Rodriguez, giving her a small, encouraging nod. She saw Officer Ben Carter, looking nervous but resolute. And she saw them, Frank Miller and several other known members of the Watchmen, their expressions a mixture of sullen resentment and forced indifference. Miller, in particular, seemed to be smirking, as if this whole affair was a temporary inconvenience, a political charade that would eventually pass, leaving their power intact. He clearly didn't recognize her as the woman from the courtroom. To him, she was just another suit, another outsider who didn't understand real policing. Serena placed her hand on the Bible, her voice clear and steady as she recited the oath of office, swearing to uphold the Constitution and the laws of Northwood City and to faithfully discharge the duties of Chief of Police. When she finished, a polite, somewhat restrained applause filled the room. Then, it was her turn to speak. She approached the podium, her presence commanding, her gaze sweeping across the auditorium, lingering for a brief moment on Miller and his cohorts before addressing the assembled crowd. Esteemed members of the City Council, Mr. Henderson, honored guests, and most importantly, the citizens of Northwood and the men and women of the Northwood Police Department, she began, her voice calm but infused with an undeniable authority. I stand before you today, deeply honored by the trust you have placed in me. I am also acutely aware of the challenges that lie ahead. Northwood is a city with a proud history, but it is also a city grappling with a crisis of trust between its police department and the communities it serves. She didn't pull any punches. She spoke of a need for accountability, for transparency, for a fundamental shift in the culture of the NWPD. She outlined her vision for community policing, for de-escalation training, for a robust and independent civilian oversight board. With each point, she could feel the temperature in the room changing. The community leaders and reform-minded officers nodded in agreement, their expressions hopeful. The watchmen, however, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their smirks fading, replaced by looks of growing alarm. Miller's eyes narrowed as he listened, a flicker of unease, perhaps even a dawning, horrified recognition, beginning to register. Could it be? No, it wasn't possible. And let me be unequivocally clear on one point, Serena continued, her voice hardening, her gaze now fixed directly on Frank Miller. There is no place in the Northwood Police Department for officers who abuse their authority, who betray their oath, who believe that their badge grants them impunity. There is no place for those who treat any citizen with disrespect, with contempt, or with unwarranted aggression, whether it be on the streets, in our precincts, or even, she paused for emphasis, within the halls of justice themselves. Miller's face went pale. His eyes, which had been narrowed in suspicion, now widened in shock as the connection finally, irrevocably, clicked. The woman at the podium, the new chief of police, was the same woman he had kicked and sneered at in Judge Harrison's courtroom just days before. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His smirk was long gone, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. Several other officers, those who had witnessed or heard about the courtroom incident, also began to stir, whispering amongst themselves, their faces reflecting a similar dawning horror. The trap, so carefully laid, had been sprung. Serena hadn't named him, hadn't explicitly referenced the incident. She didn't need to. Her pointed gaze, the subtle emphasis in her words had done the work. She had sent a clear, undeniable message to Miller, to the watchman, and to the entire department. She knew. She had seen their ugliness firsthand, and she was not afraid. My door will always be open to officers who are committed to serving this community with integrity and respect, Serena concluded, her voice ringing with conviction. But to those who resist reform, who cling to outdated and abusive practices, who believe they are above the law they are sworn to uphold, let me say this. Your time in the Northwood Police Department is coming to an end. Change is here, and it starts now. The auditorium erupted in applause, this time loud, sustained, and filled with a palpable sense of hope from many, and trepidation from a few. Frank Miller sat frozen in his seat, the applause washing over him like a wave of condemnation. The world, as he knew it, had just been turned upside down. The woman he had casually assaulted was now his chief, his boss, his judge, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that his days of arrogant impunity were over. The aftermath of Chief Serena Washington's inaugural speech was immediate and electrifying. The watchmen, led by a visibly shaken Frank Miller, left the auditorium in a tight, agitated cluster, their usual bravado replaced by a mixture of disbelief and fury. They had been publicly, albeit indirectly, called out, and the implications were terrifying. Miller, in particular, felt a cold dread seeping into his bones. The new chief hadn't just made a generic statement about reform. Her words, her gaze, had been a personal indictment. She knew. He replayed the courtroom incident in his mind, his casual cruelty, his sneering dismissal. How could he have been so stupid, so arrogant? He had kicked his own damn boss. The thought made him physically ill. Community leaders and reform advocates, on the other hand, were jubilant. They swarmed Serena after her speech, expressing their enthusiastic support, their hope for a new era in Northwood. Chief Washington, that was the most honest and courageous speech I've ever heard from an NWPD leader, Reverend Green declared, his eyes shining. You have given this city hope. Serena accepted their congratulations with grace, but her mind was already on the next steps. The speech was just the beginning. Now came the hard part, translating words into action, dismantling a deeply entrenched system of corruption and abuse. Her first official act as chief was to announce the immediate formation of a new professional standards bureau to be headed by Captain Maria Rodriguez. This new bureau would have expanded powers to investigate officer misconduct, with a clear mandate for transparency and accountability. She also announced a comprehensive review of all use-of-force incidents from the past 5 years and a freeze on all promotions pending a review of service records and complaint histories. These moves sent a clear signal through the department. Business as usual was over. Frank Miller, back at the precinct, found himself the subject of hushed whispers and sideways glances. His usual cronies were suddenly less eager to associate with him. The aura of invincibility he had cultivated for years was crumbling. He tried to bluster, to dismiss the new chief as all talk, but his words lacked their usual conviction. The image of Serena Washington at the podium, her eyes burning into him, was seared into his memory. Later that day, Miller was summoned to Captain Rodriguez's new office. Rodriguez, no longer the cautious ally, but now a key figure in Serena's reform team, regarded him with a cool, appraising gaze. Officer Miller, she began, her tone strictly professional. Chief Washington has asked me to review a number underscore of outstanding citizen complaints. Your name appears frequently. Miller shifted uncomfortably. Those were all cleared, Captain. Internal Affairs found no wrongdoing. Perhaps, Rodriguez said, her voice devoid of inflection. But under the chief's new directive, all past complaint investigations are being reopened, particularly those where the findings seem inconsistent with the available evidence. We'll start with the incident in Judge Harrison's courtroom last Tuesday. There were several witnesses. Miller's blood ran cold. Witnesses. He hadn't counted on that. He had assumed the woman, like so many others he had bullied, would be too intimidated or insignificant to pursue the matter. He had never imagined she would turn out to be the damn chief of police. "That was a misunderstanding, Captain," Miller stammered, his voice suddenly hoarse. "I tripped. It was an accident." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "An accident? That's not what the preliminary witness statement suggests, Officer Miller. Nor is it what the courtroom security footage appears to show." Footage? He hadn't even considered the security cameras. His mind raced, desperately seeking an escape route, but he was trapped. The casual arrogance that had defined his career was now his undoing. While Miller was squirming under Rodriguez's scrutiny, Serena was meeting with Officer Ben Carter. "Officer Carter," she said, "I appreciate the courage you've shown. I know it hasn't been easy. I would like you to consider a temporary assignment to Captain Rodriguez's Professional Standards Bureau. Your integrity and your first-hand knowledge of certain internal dynamics would be invaluable." Carter was stunned. Just days ago, he was a pariah, ostracized for questioning the watchman. Now, the new chief was offering him a key role in the reform effort. "Chief," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "it would be an honor." Serena smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "The honor is mine, Officer Carter. We have a lot of work to do." The battle lines were being drawn. The watchmen, realizing their very existence was threatened, began to push back. Anonymous flyers appeared in precinct locker rooms, accusing Serena of being anti-police, of launching a witch hunt. Union representatives started making noise about officer morale and due process. But Serena was prepared. She had her allies, Rodriguez, Carter, the community leaders, even the grudging support of city manager Henderson, who now saw her as his best chance of salvaging his own political career. And she had the undeniable moral high ground. The story of Miller's courtroom assault, though not yet officially public, was beginning to leak out within the department, further eroding his support and galvanizing those who had suffered under the watchman's reign. Frank Miller was about to become the poster child for everything Serena Washington was determined to change. The following weeks in Northwood City were a period of intense upheaval and transformation within the NWPD. Chief Serena Washington moved with a swiftness and decisiveness that left the watchmen reeling and reform advocates cautiously optimistic. The reopened investigation into Officer Frank Miller's conduct in Judge Harrison's courtroom became a focal point. Courtroom security footage, subpoenaed by Captain Rodriguez's new Professional Standards Bureau, clearly showed Miller deliberately kicking Serena, followed by his sneering remark. Multiple eyewitnesses, including court staff and citizens who had initially been too intimidated to speak out, came forward to corroborate the incident. Miller, facing irrefutable evidence, was suspended without pay pending a full disciplinary hearing. His attempts to rally support from his watchman allies proved largely futile. With Serena Washington at the helm, and with Captain Rodriguez and Officer Carter leading the charge within the Professional Standards Bureau, the old system of mutual protection and cover-ups was crumbling. Many of the watchmen, seeing the writing on the wall, began to distance themselves from Miller, suddenly claiming they had always had reservations about his aggressive tactics. Their bravado, it turned out, was directly proportional to their perceived impunity. Serena also initiated a series of town hall meetings in different neighborhoods across Northwood, particularly in those communities that had suffered most under the NWPD's previous regime. She listened patiently and empathetically as citizens poured out years of frustration, anger, and grief over their experiences with police misconduct. She didn't make excuses. She didn't offer platitudes. She acknowledged their pain, apologized for the department's past failings, and pledged her unwavering commitment to building a police force that served all citizens with fairness and respect. These meetings were not easy. There was skepticism, anger, and raw emotion. But Serena's sincerity, her willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and her clear vision for reform began to slowly, painstakingly, rebuild bridges of trust. She also made it a point to regularly walk the beat with patrol officers, visiting different precincts, engaging with rank-and-file cops, not as a distant chief, but as a fellow law enforcement professional. She wanted to understand their challenges, their concerns, and to identify those officers who, like Ben Carter, were committed to good policing but had been stifled by the old culture. During one such walk-along in Miller's former precinct, she encountered several younger officers who seemed both intimidated by her presence and intrigued by her approach. One of them, a young Latina officer named Sofia Ramirez, hesitantly shared her frustration with the pressure to meet arrest quotas and the lack of support for community engagement initiatives. "We joined to make a difference, Chief," Officer Ramirez said, "not just to write tickets and harass people. But under the old command, it felt like that's all they cared about." Serena listened intently. "Officer Ramirez," she said, "your voice, your perspective is exactly what this department needs. I want you to be part of the solution. I'm forming a new community policing task force, and I'd like you to consider being on it." Officer Ramirez's eyes lit up. It was a small gesture, but it signaled a significant shift. The new chief was actively seeking out and empowering those who shared her vision for reform. The Watchmen, however, did not go down without a fight. They launched a vicious, anonymous smear campaign against Serena, leaking doctored emails and fabricated internal reports to pliable local bloggers, attempting to portray her as corrupt, incompetent, or overly aggressive in her reform efforts. They tried to intimidate witnesses in the Miller case and other reopened investigations. But Serena, with the support of City Manager Henderson, who was now firmly in her corner, seeing her as a political asset and a surprisingly robust PR strategy, fought back. She held press conferences, released factual information to counter the smears, and emphasized her commitment to due process, even for those officers accused of misconduct. The turning point came when Officer Ben Carter, armed with evidence he had discreetly gathered over months, provided the Professional Standards Bureau with detailed information about the Watchmen's internal operations, including recordings of Miller and others bragging about their exploits and discussing strategies to undermine reform efforts. This evidence, combined with the testimony of other officers who finally felt safe enough to come forward, broke the back of the Watchmen's resistance. Frank Miller's disciplinary hearing was a public spectacle. The courtroom footage was played, witnesses testified, and Miller's attempts to portray himself as the victim of a political witch hunt fell flat. He was found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer, assault, and perjury. The recommendation was termination. The Civil Service Commission, under pressure from City Hall and public opinion, upheld the decision. Frank Miller, the arrogant symbol of the NWPD's old guard, was fired. His downfall sent a shockwave through the department. It was a clear message. The era of impunity was over. Accountability was real. The dismissal of Frank Miller was a watershed moment for the Northwood Police Department and for the city as a whole. It signaled that Chief Serena Washington was not just talking about reform. She was enacting it decisively and without fear or favor. The Watchmen, their leader disgraced and their power base crumbling, began to fracture. Some, facing overwhelming evidence of their own misconduct in reopened cases, chose early retirement. Others, hoping for leniency, began cooperating with Captain Rodriguez's Professional Standards Bureau, providing further insights into the depths of the old guard's corruption. Several more officers were subsequently disciplined or terminated. The NWPD was undergoing a painful but necessary purge. Serena, however, knew that firings alone wouldn't change the culture. She focused on rebuilding, on instilling new values from the ground up. She overhauled the department's training academy curriculum, introducing mandatory courses in de-escalation, implicit bias awareness, community engagement, and constitutional policing. She personally taught several of these classes, sharing her experiences and her vision with new recruits. She championed a new guardian model of policing, emphasizing that officers were there to protect and serve all members of the community, not to act as an occupying force. Promotions were no longer based on arrest quotas or loyalty to the old guard, but on demonstrated commitment to these new principles, on community feedback, and on problem-solving skills. Officers like Ben Carter and Sofia Ramirez found themselves elevated to positions of influence, becoming role models for a new generation of NWPD officers. Captain Maria Rodriguez, as head of the Professional Standards Bureau, became a symbol of fairness and integrity, ensuring that complaints were investigated thoroughly and impartially. The changes were not without resistance. Some veteran officers, uncomfortable with the new approach, grumbled about political correctness and coddling criminals. But the tide had turned. The majority of the department, especially younger officers, embraced the reforms, eager for a chance to do their jobs with honor and to regain the community's trust. The impact on Northwood City was tangible. Citizen complaints against the police dropped significantly. Use of force incidents declined. Community trust, while still fragile, began to show signs of repair. Reverend Green and other community leaders, who had once been staunch critics of the NWPD, became active partners in new neighborhood policing initiatives. They organized Coffee with a Cop events, youth outreach programs, and joint task forces to address local crime issues collaboratively. Serena Washington became a nationally recognized figure, a symbol of courageous leadership and successful police reform. She was invited to speak at conferences, to advise other cities grappling with similar challenges. But she always remained grounded, focused on the ongoing work in Northwood. She knew that true, lasting change was a marathon, not a sprint. One evening, about a year after her swearing in, Serena was working late in her office when there was a knock on her door. It was Frank Miller. He looked older, diminished, the arrogance completely gone, replaced by a weary resignation. "Chief Washington," he said, his voice quiet, "can I have a word?" Serena, surprised, gestured for him to sit. She had expected never to see him again after his termination. I just wanted to say, I was wrong," Miller began, his gaze fixed on the floor. "About a lot of things. About you. About how I police this city. I didn't see it then, but I see it now. The way I treated people, the way I treated you in that courtroom, there was no excuse." He looked up, his eyes holding a hint of shame. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know, I understand now. What you're trying to do here, it's right. This city, it needs it." Serena listened patiently. She saw no guile in his words, only a broken man grappling with the consequences of his past actions. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "it takes a certain kind of courage to admit when you're wrong, especially after so much time. Perhaps this is the beginning of a different path for you." Miller nodded slowly. "Maybe. I wanted you to hear it from me." He stood to leave. "Thank you for your time, Chief." After he left, Serena sat for a long moment, reflecting. Miller's visit wasn't a full redemption, not by a long shot. But it was a small sign that even the most entrenched attitudes could, perhaps, eventually shift. The fight for a just and equitable Northwood was far from over. There would be new challenges, new setbacks. But looking out her window at the city lights, Serena Washington felt a quiet sense of hope. Change was possible, and it had started with a single, contemptuous kick in a courtroom, a kick that had inadvertently set in motion a revolution of reform, led by the very woman who had been its target. The lesson was clear: never underestimate the power of quiet dignity, unwavering integrity, and the courage to stand up for what is right, even when you're the one being kicked down. Because sometimes the person you underestimate today might just be the one who changes your world tomorrow. What qualities do you think are most essential for a leader trying to reform a resistant organization? Is it courage, strategic thinking, empathy, or something else? Share your insights in the comments below. And if this story of transformation and accountability resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives of justice in action. Remember to share this with anyone who believes in the power of principled leadership to make a difference.